as far as thinking about it in the Kurdish context, and you say that that by like the 1970s, you'd started to have this specific kind of national conception and nationalist movement.
Well, I mean, basically, at the elite level, you have it, beginning in the late 19th century, early 20th century. You see the first wave of Kurdish political activism coming into the fore following the 1908 constitutional revolution in the Ottoman Empire, which gave a lot of opportunity for peoples in the Middle East to openly, discuss national issues. Doesn't mean they were separatists. There was most Muslim minorities in the Ottoman Empire, for example, regarded themselves as nations, but saw their futures as being tied together within a kind of constitutional, supranational, multinational polity, not too dissimilar from tendencies within the Austro-Hungarian Empire or tendencies within the Russian Empire at that point. Now, after the end of the First World War, of course, the Middle East got partitioned into explicit nation states. The Ottoman Empire was, an empire. It was, there was an attempt to forge a kind of Ottoman national identity, but that had some success, more success than people give it credit for. But once the empire collapsed, you have the formation of new identities. You have explicit Arab nation states, and you have explicit Ottoman nation states, but at the same time you also have the Arabs being partitioned amongst themselves with Syrians and so on and so forth. So you have this conflict in the Arab world, for example, between the Qawmiya nationalism, the nationalism of sort of race and language and culture, and the Wataniya nationalism of territorial states. So sort of pan-Arab nationalism versus kind of nation-state nationalism. And the Kurdish movement kind of parallels that in an interesting way, because although there are no Kurdish states, you have this sort of split, not between kind of the cultural divides amongst the Kurds, not so much based on culture or dialect, but based on which political state they lived in. So, for example, the two main dialects of Kurdish are Kirmanji and Sorani. Sorani is spoken in Iran and Iraq, and Kirmanji is spoken mainly in Turkey, Syria, but also in Iran and Iraq. But, you don't see Kirmanji nationalism and you don't see Sorani nationalism. Rather, you see different Kurdish nationalisms with different political orientations developing within each of these states, despite these kind of let's say, primordial divisions. So the divisions that do exist within Kurdish nationalism today are either ideological or they're based on the international frontiers because, the political conditions that prevailed in Turkey, Iraq, and Iran were different. They affected the Kurdish. In all those countries, the Kurds were kind of discriminated in, but in different ways, which affected the political orientation of those movements and gave rise to, if we do want to talk about a multiplicity of Kurdish nationhoods today, we can talk about maybe like you have this kind of pan-Kurdish nationalism, which is powerful amongst the diaspora, which is aspirational amongst many Kurds. But then you have a kind of a more institutionally powerful kind of territorial version of Kurdish nationalism, which is a Kurdish nationalism in Turkey, Kurdish nationalism in Iraq, a Kurdish nationalism in Iran, and a Kurdish nationalism in Syria, all of which have their own specificities and political orientations and political organizations.
Yeah, well, let's talk about some of the political organizations, right? So, like, I think one of the first acronyms you mentioned, and something that people who might know a little bit of this are likely to have heard of, is the PKK. So what's that, and when did it get started?
Sure. So the PKK emerged in the late 1970s in Turkey. And Turkey is home to the largest population of Kurds, and the PKK was very much regarded itself as a pan-Kurdish movement. So it argued for the complete independence of Kurdistan and the creation of a united, independent Kurdistan. They received support from Syria in their early days. So they actually, initially, they excluded Syria from their Greater Kurdistan plan. And in fact, they even accepted the Syrian government narrative at the time that most of the Kurds in Syria originally came from Turkey, so they weren't really Syrians, because, you know, Kurds in Syria, many of them were stripped of their citizenship, and you know, what kind of citizenship, without citizenship. And the Syrian government allowed Syrian Kurds to join the PKK to kind of distract them, sending them over to Turkey to cause trouble with Turkey, which was their rival. So the PKK emerged as this kind of left-wing, very traditional kind of Marxist-Leninist style political party.
Yeah, so that stands for Kurdish Workers' Party.
Kurdistan Workers' Party. So yeah, interestingly enough, most Kurdish political parties don't call themselves Kurdish; they call themselves Kurdistan. So they have a very strong territorial aspect to it. And this left-wing political orientation, the very strikingly left-wing political orientation of the Kurdish movement in Turkey, is not haphazard or accidental. When the Republic of Turkey was founded, initially the Kurdish movement in Turkey kind of grew out of discontented tribal leaders who were angry at state centralization, secularization, and sort of cultural oppression, and intellectuals who were angered by an exclusion from state institutions, political persecution, and so on and so forth. So you have this kind, in the 20s and 30s, you kind of have this alliance between intellectuals and tribal leaders. However, the Turkish Republic, especially after the 1930s, was very good at assimilating tribal leaders and landowners into the Ankara regime. So this kind of traditional ruling class of Kurdish society, many of them were integrated into Turkish political parties. And this, again, alienated intellectuals who were like, we don't, you know, why is this uneducated tribal leader being the parliamentarian for Van just because he can convince 2,000 people from his tribe to vote for him and he owns, you know, 50 hectares of land, he gets, but we went to university and stuff. So you have this kind of alienated left-wing Kurdish intelligentsia who's very attracted to communist revolutionary movements. At the same time, you have some of these Kurdish tribal leaders attempt within the constitutional framework of Turkey to get like more resources for the Kurdish region, to have the government loosen up on the very, very harsh cultural restrictions placed on Kurdish language and printing and things like that. So you have this kind of constitutional kind of do it within the system wing represented by kind of tribal leaders who try and say, hey, don't be so brutal to Kurds. And then this kind of left-wing intelligentsia. Both these movements fail by the 1970s. The left-wing movement is crushed in Turkey, and also the Kurds are kind of pissed that the left is not really taking the Kurdish question super seriously. And also this kind of Eastism movement, they call it Doğuculuk, this kind of like, let's solve the economic issues, let's do this. This also kind of fails. And so the PKK emerges a kind of like a maximalist cultural Kurdish nationalists and maximalist sort of communists at the same time. And in 1980, there's a coup. A lot of Kurdish groups are kind of arrested. PKK manages to survive that. Then it starts like attacking other Kurdish groups, such as the Kurdistan Socialist Party, for being reformists, and launches a guerrilla warfare in 1984. You know, launches this huge fight against the Turkish state, which gains a significant degree of popular support. No, by no means like the dominant strain amongst Kurdish political thought, but it becomes a very attractive movement, you know, and places itself within this anti-imperialist struggle as they are fighting Turkey, which they will, you know, were like, Turkey is NATO's largest army. So you have the emergence of this left-wing orientated movement. Of course, in the 90s and beyond, things get a little bit more complicated because the Soviet Union collapses. So the ideological kind of divide in which the PKK was created, you know, doesn't kind of fit anymore.
Yeah, yeah. So I do want to just dwell on this for a minute, right? Since my understanding, you know, which is hazy, is that you know, after the fall of the Soviet Union and that kind of like orthodox, you know, Soviet Marxist Leninism, you know, stops being quite so attractive. That later some of these leaders actually drift towards being influenced by this American radical Murray Bookchin, who is this kind of eccentric quasi-Marxist, quasi-anarchist. So I mean, can you just speak briefly to what the ideological drift is there?
Sure. So in the early 90s, the PKK begins to soften its line. It begins pushing for autonomy within the nation states instead of full independence. We also at the same time see the emergence of a parliamentary wing to the Kurdish movement. There are several Kurdish political parties or Kurdish orientated political parties that operate within the parliamentary system but are shut down. The HDP, which is the most recent iteration of this, is one of them. So there's this kind of moderating in the 1990s.
You've just watched part of a Give Them More patron bonus episode. To access the full episode and every other episode, sign up as a patron at patreon.com/Ben Burgis.